Welcome back to W-broux, where the woods whisper secrets and danger lurks in the shadows. Before you drift into the world of nightmares, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying our spine-chilling episodes. Your support helps keep the horror alive. Now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for another tale of terror. Let's begin. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. Months of planning, poring over maps and reviews, had finally led me to this trail, tucked away deep in the wilderness. Far from the constant hum of my daily life, the hustle of the city, and the exhausting demands of work. I'm not what you'd call outdoorsy, far from it, actually, but I figured a few days alone in the serenity of nature might help me clear my head. Breathe a little, think a little. The trail was well known but not overcrowded, winding through thick woods and gradually climbing into the hills. Just enough to feel remote but not so isolated that it felt unsafe. At least, that's what I told myself as I parked my car at the trailhead that morning, the sun just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs with the unmistakable scent of pine and earth. As I adjusted my backpack and set out, the stillness of the morning was broken only by the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail. There was no one else around, not even a car in the parking lot when I'd arrived. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd wanted. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The trail meandered through dense trees, sunlight filtering down in dappled patches as the birds chirped their morning songs. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and my own footsteps. That was until I reached the fork. About 3 hours in, the trail split one path leading deeper into the forest, the other curving off toward the sound of water. I hesitated for a moment, considering my options. The map said both routes eventually looped back to the same place, but the river path looked particularly inviting in the heat of the day. That's when I heard a voice behind me. Warning. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest as I spun around. I hadn't heard anyone approaching. Standing a few feet back was a man dressed in a park ranger uniform, a friendly smile on his face, though something about him seemed off. He wasn't tall, maybe a few inches shorter than me, and his uniform looked a little worn, like it had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes, but I could still feel them on me, studying me. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, raising a hand in a gesture of goodwill. "Just wanted to check in. Quiet morning, isn't it?" I nodded, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. There was nothing overtly strange about him. After all, park rangers were supposed to be out here, right? But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way he stood there, smiling a little too widely, a little too still, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Yeah, quiet's good," I managed, forcing a smile. "Just out here for a solo hike. Thought I'd get some fresh air." The ranger's smile never wavered, but his eyes seemed to narrow slightly, as if he were assessing me. For a moment, I wondered if I'd said something wrong. His gaze flicked to the split in the trail behind me. "Which way you headed?" he asked, stepping a little closer. I hesitated, instinctively pointing toward the path that led deeper into the woods. I was thinking about heading that way, I said, though now I wasn't so sure. The ranger's expression shifted subtly, his smile tightening. "I'd recommend the river path," he said, his voice dropping just a fraction. "The other trail's been a little rough lately. Storm damage. Safer to stick by the water." There was nothing particularly threatening about his words, but the way he said them calm, steady, with that smile still plastered on his face, made my stomach twist. I nodded, not wanting to seem rude. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, already considering my options. "I'll keep that in mind." The ranger didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his gaze unwavering. "You hiking alone?" Something in the way he asked made me uncomfortable. It wasn't a question he needed to ask, and it felt too personal. I paused before answering, choosing my words carefully. "Meeting a friend later," I lied. The ranger's smile flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in my head. "Is that so?" he murmured, as though he didn't quite believe me. He took another step closer, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. "I'll walk with you a bit," he offered, his tone casual, but there was something in his eyes that made my throat tighten. "Make sure you don't miss any signs. The trail can get tricky this time of year." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to say no, to keep walking, to get as far away from him as possible. But the words wouldn't come. He was a park ranger, right? Just doing his job. There was no reason to be afraid. And yet, I forced myself to nod. "Sure, thanks." We started walking, the silence between us growing heavier with each step. The ranger moved at an easy pace, but there was a tension in the air now, an unspoken unease that seemed to settle over everything. I found myself glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, studying him more closely. His uniform, as I'd noticed before, was a little off. Frayed at the edges, the patches on his sleeves faded. But it wasn't just the wear and tear that bothered me. It was the color. It wasn't quite the same as the uniforms I'd seen in photos when I'd looked up information about the park. His boots, two more like hiking boots than the heavy-duty kind you'd expect a ranger to wear. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I thought about asking him about it, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I focused on the trail ahead, trying to shake off the gnawing fear that had taken hold of me. As we walked, the path began to narrow, the trees closing in around us. The sunlight that had once filtered through the branches was now mostly blocked out, casting long, dark shadows over the ground. The air felt colder, heavier, and I realized with a start that we weren't heading toward the river anymore. The ranger hadn't said a word, but I could feel his presence beside me, a quiet, looming weight that I couldn't ignore. "Are we still on the right trail?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The ranger didn't look at me. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "We're close to the river. It's just over the ridge." I glanced ahead, my stomach tightening. There wasn't a ridge. At least there wasn't supposed to be one. The trail wasn't supposed to climb this much, and I hadn't seen any signs for the river in quite a while. My heart began to race, and I risked a glance behind me, wondering how far we'd come, wondering how far I'd have to go if I turned back. That's when the ranger stopped. I nearly walked into him, not expecting the sudden halt. He stood there, staring off into the trees, his face unreadable. The silence was suffocating, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. Then he turned, slowly, his smile gone. "You should be more careful out here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are all kinds of people in these woods." My skin crawled, and I took a step back, my body moving on its own before I even realized what I was doing. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. The ranger took a step toward me, his eyes locked on mine, dark and cold. You never know who you might run into. I didn't wait for him to make another move. My body took over, and I turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and quick, and I knew he was right there, just a few feet behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trail was barely visible now, just a narrow strip of dirt and roots winding through the trees. I stumbled, my foot catching on a branch, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I kept running, the fear driving me forward. Somehow, I made it back to the main trail. I burst out of the trees, nearly tripping over my own feet as I skidded to a stop. The ranger was nowhere in sight. I spun around, scanning the woods, but there was no sign of him, just the trees and the empty path stretching out before me. My hands were shaking, my entire body buzzing with fear and adrenaline, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept moving, walking as fast as I could, almost jogging, until I saw the trailhead in the distance. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there for what felt like hours, my heart still racing, my mind replaying everything over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who was that man? Why had he pretended to be a park ranger? What had he wanted? I drove straight to the park office, my hands still trembling as I told them what had happened. They looked concerned, but when I described the man, they shook their heads. There was no one matching his description working in the park that day, or any day. Camping had always been my escape from the world. The quiet of the woods, the crackle of a fire, and the distant rustle of leaves were all I needed to feel at peace. So when I set out for a solo trip into a remote part of the forest, I wasn't expecting anything but the usual peace, tranquility, and a night under the stars. I had camped alone dozens of times, but this trip felt a little different from the beginning. I had picked a spot off the beaten path, a little clearing surrounded by towering trees, perfect for a night away from everything. After hours of hiking through the dense forest, I hadn't seen another person, and the solitude was exactly what I had wanted. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, I started setting up camp, eager to relax after the long trek. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick in the atmosphere, and I had just finished pitching my tent when I noticed a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't thick or black like a fire out of control, but just enough to signal that someone was nearby. That was odd. I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead, nor had I passed any other hikers during the day. Still, I wasn't particularly concerned, just curious. Maybe another group had arrived after me, and given how remote the area was, I figured it might be other experienced campers. I decided to head over and introduce myself. After all, I wouldn't mind some company before nightfall. I grabbed my water bottle, threw on my jacket, and made my way toward the smoke. As I approached the source, the faint sound of voices reached my ears, low and murmuring, blending with the wind as it rustled through the trees. The clearing opened up to reveal 4 people sitting around a campfire, 2 men and 2 women, all in their 20s or 30s. They seemed like regular campers, dressed in flannels and cargo pants, with backpacks casually thrown on the ground nearby. The fire was crackling softly, casting flickering shadows across their faces as they sat in silence, staring into the flames. "Hey there," I called out, giving a small wave. "Mind if I join you guys for a bit?" All 4 heads turned toward me at once, their movements unsettlingly synchronized. For a moment, none of them said anything, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Their eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if they hadn't heard me approach. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before one of the men, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, finally stood up, a stick held over the fire with what looked like meat roasting on the end. Sure, he said, after what felt like an eternity. His voice was gruff, but he forced a smile. Come on over. Fire's warm. Something about the way he said it made me hesitate, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe they were just surprised to see someone else out here. I dropped my pack next to theirs and sat down on a log near the fire, glancing around the circle. Thanks, I said, trying to break the ice. I'm camping just over the ridge. Saw your fire and figured I'd say hi. Not many people out this way. The others didn't respond, just kept staring into the fire, their faces expressionless. It was eerie, but I told myself they were probably just tired or deep in thought. Still, their silence weighed heavy, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort that was settling in my chest. After a few awkward moments, I tried to strike up some small talk. You guys out here for long? This is a pretty remote spot. The bearded man, the one who had spoken before, glanced at me with that same strange grin. We're just passing through, he said. Not from around here. The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile and nodded. Yeah, it's a good spot for camping. Quiet. He just stared at me for a moment, his eyes flicking over me as if sizing me up. The others remained silent, one of the women glancing nervously between him and the fire, as though she were waiting for something. What about you, he asked, his voice calm but unnervingly focused. You out here alone. I hesitated, something in his tone making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was no reason to lie, but the question seemed too direct, too probing. Nah. Meeting a friend in the morning, I lied, hoping it would put him off. The man's grin faded slightly, and he exchanged a glance with the other man, who hadn't spoken yet. The air between us felt charged, as though I had stepped into a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. The silence stretched again, thick and oppressive, and I found myself wondering why I had come over in the first place. The fire crackled, the wood hissing as the flames danced, but the atmosphere felt stifling. One of the women, the younger one, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward me for the first time since I had arrived. She looked tense, her face pale in the flickering firelight, and something about her expression made my stomach churn. So what's your plan for the night? The other man spoke suddenly, his voice low and too calm. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a shaved head and a tattoo creeping up the side of his neck. His eyes were dark, unreadable, as they fixed on me. I forced a laugh, trying to keep things light, even though my instincts were screaming at me to leave. Just camping. Set up over the ridge. I'll probably turn in soon. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You sure you'll be all right out there by yourself? It gets dark fast in these woods. My throat tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The way he said it so casual, yet so ominous, made me feel like I was missing something, like there was an unspoken threat hanging in the air. The younger woman glanced at me again, her eyes wide and pleading, but she didn't say a word. The others, too, remained unnervingly still, their faces blank and emotionless as they stared into the fire. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get out of there, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I stood slowly, brushing off my pants, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, thanks for the company, I said, forcing a smile. I think I'll head back before it gets too late. The bearded man's smile faltered, and for a moment his eyes flicked to the others. The woman shifted again, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and the man with the tattoo stood up, taking a slow step toward me. "You sure you don't want to stay?" he asked, his voice a little harder now, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "We've got plenty of room. No need to head back alone." My heart was racing, and I could feel my palms growing slick with sweat. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't show them I was scared. Not yet. "Yeah, I'm sure," I said, my voice a little shakier than I intended. "You guys have a good night." I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on them as I moved toward the edge of the clearing. The man with the tattoo took another step toward me, his eyes locked on mine, and I could feel the tension rising, thick and suffocating. "You sure you'll be okay out there?" he asked again, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place, mocking. Threat? I didn't know. I nodded, forcing myself to keep moving. "Yeah, I'll be fine." As I turned and started walking, I could feel their eyes on my back, the weight of their stares pressing down on me like a physical force. My hands were trembling, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps, but I forced myself to keep moving, not too fast, not too slow. Just calm. Normal. When I reached the tree line, I glanced back. They were still sitting around the fire, but now all four of them were watching me, their faces half hidden in the shadows. My skin crawled, and I quickly turned back, making my way down the trail. I hadn't gone more than 20 yards when I heard the sound of movement behind me. Footsteps, quick and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves. My heart leaped into my throat, and I resisted the urge to run. "Don't panic," I told myself. "Don't let them know you're scared." But the footsteps were getting closer, and I knew I didn't have much time. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think of was getting back to my camp, grabbing my stuff, and getting out of there as fast as I could. I picked up my pace, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the trail I had come in on. The footsteps behind me didn't stop. They were getting closer now, too close. I couldn't hold back any longer. I broke into a run, sprinting through the trees as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps behind me quickened, and I knew they were chasing me. I didn't dare look back. Branches whipped at my face, and my feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The sound of my own breath was deafening, but I could still hear them, whoever was behind me, gaining on me with every step. I burst out of the trees and into the small clearing where I had set up my camp. My tent was still standing, my gear untouched, but I didn't stop to grab anything. I just bolted for my car, my heart slamming against my ribcage as I fumbled for my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked, but finally I managed to yank it open and throw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I couldn't hear anything outside. No footsteps, no voices, just the sound of my own breathing filling the car. I risked a glance out the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the dark, looming shadows of the forest. I started the engine, my hands still shaking, and floored it out of there, not looking back. The night swallowed the road behind me, and I drove faster than I ever had, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. It wasn't until I was safe, surrounded by the glow of streetlights, that I realized I had left everything behind: my tent, my gear, all of it. But none of that mattered. I wasn't going back. Ever. Whatever those people had wanted, it wasn't good. And I had the sickening feeling that if I hadn't trusted my gut, if I hadn't left when I did, I wouldn't be telling this story. It was supposed to be an easy weekend hike, nothing out of the ordinary, just a short 2-hour trek along a familiar trail. My boyfriend Aaron and I had done this hike before, and we always made it back to the car by late afternoon. It wasn't the kind of hike you worried about. There were no dangerous cliffs, no river crossings, no need for a compass. Just a simple, peaceful walk in the woods. The day started out perfect. We arrived at the trailhead around 10 a.m., laced up our boots, and set off under a clear, pale blue sky. The air was crisp but not too cold, and the scent of the forest was invigorating. A few other hikers were heading back down as we made our way up, but for the most part, the trail was quiet. That suited me just fine. I wasn't out there to socialize. I just wanted to enjoy the fresh air, the serenity of nature, and of course Aaron's company. He was always the more confident one. When it came to the outdoors, he loved it. He said it was the only time he ever truly relaxed, away from work, away from the constant buzz of his phone. We had been walking for about an hour when we came to a small clearing. It was a spot we'd stopped at before, a place where the trail wound alongside a little stream that trickled over smooth rocks. The sunlight dappled the water in a way that made the whole scene feel magical. It was quiet, serene. I set my pack down on a flat rock by the water and stretched my legs, savoring the feeling of muscles working after a long, sedentary week in the office. Aaron stood nearby, checking his phone for signal, though he already knew there wouldn't be any out here. "I'm just going to grab some water from up the trail," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "There's a better stream a little further on." I nodded, not thinking much of it. "Okay, I'll catch up in a few minutes." Aaron smiled, waved, and disappeared around a bend in the trail, leaving me to enjoy the stillness of the clearing. I wasn't in any rush. I took a sip of water, stretched a little more, and then sat down to take in the quiet beauty of the forest. The breeze rustled gently through the trees, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft, golden beams. It was peaceful, exactly what we both needed. After about 10 minutes, I decided it was time to catch up. I put my pack back on and headed up the trail, following the path Aaron had taken. I expected to see him not far ahead, maybe filling his water bottle by the stream or poking around at something interesting. He was always one to wander off, distracted by the little things nature had to offer. But as I walked, I didn't see him. At first, I wasn't concerned. The trail curved through dense trees, and I figured he had just gone a little further than expected. Maybe he'd found something cool, a hidden waterfall, or a particularly beautiful view. "Aaron," I called out, my voice echoing softly through the woods. "You up ahead?" No answer. I kept walking, the trail winding through the trees, but the further I went, the more I began to feel a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. After 5 more minutes of walking, I still hadn't seen him. No movement up ahead, no sign of his bright orange jacket. I called out his name again, louder this time. "Aaron, where are you?" Still nothing. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the trail and the surrounding woods for any sign of him. Maybe he'd wandered off the path to explore something he did that sometimes, getting lost in his own world. But he wouldn't have gone far. He knew better than that. And by now, he should have heard me calling and responded. My heart started to pound faster in my chest, and the peaceful serenity of the forest began to feel suffocating. The trees, which had once seemed welcoming, now loomed like dark sentinels, their branches thick and heavy, blocking out the sunlight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of a bird. "Aaron," I shouted again, my voice tinged with a rising panic. Still nothing. "Hey." I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he had gone a little further than I thought. Maybe he was just out of earshot. I walked faster, almost jogging now, my breath coming in short, anxious bursts. And then, after what felt like forever, I saw him, or at least I thought I did. Up ahead, in a patch of sunlight filtering through the trees, I saw the outline of a man standing on the trail. Relief washed over me for a split second, and I hurried forward, expecting to see Aaron's familiar figure turn around. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't him. The man was tall, older than Aaron, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He was wearing a dark jacket that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His clothes were dirty, as if he'd been out in the woods for a while, and he was standing still, almost unnaturally so, looking down at something on the ground. He didn't move as I approached, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you seen my boyfriend?" He went ahead of me to get some water, but I can't seem to find him. The man didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his back to me, his head tilted slightly as if he hadn't heard me. I took a few hesitant steps closer. "Hello." Slowly, almost too slowly, the man turned to face me. His eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of his cap, and his expression was unreadable blank, motionless. For a moment, I thought maybe he was just lost himself, or maybe he was one of those hikers who preferred solitude and didn't like being disturbed. But then he spoke, his voice low and too calm. "Yeah, I saw him," he said, nodding slowly. He went off the trail, back that way he gestured behind him, toward a thick patch of trees where there was no discernible path. Looked like he was looking for something. I frowned, glancing in the direction he had pointed. There was no way Aaron would have wandered off into the dense forest like that without telling me. He knew how easy it was to get lost in this area. "Are you sure?" I asked, my unease growing by the second. "There's no path over there." The man shrugged, his lips curling into a strange, lopsided smile. "Yeah, saw him go that way not too long ago. Maybe you should check it out." Something about the way he said it so casual, so matter-of-fact made my skin crawl. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. Aaron wouldn't have gone that way. He wouldn't have left the trail, so why was this man telling me otherwise? "Did he say anything to you?" I asked, my voice shaky now. The man's smile faltered for a brief moment, and his eyes flicked down the trail as if he were hiding something. "No," he said, his tone flat. He didn't say anything. I took a step back, the unease inside me growing into full-blown fear. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from this man. "I think I'll just keep looking on the trail," I said quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thanks for the help." I turned and started walking back the way I had come, by steps brisk, by hands trembling. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me as I walked away, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to see whatever expression he wore now. After a few minutes, I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was gone. The trail behind me was empty, but that did nothing to calm the rising panic inside me. Where the hell was Aaron? Why hadn't he called out to me by now? If he was lost, he would have heard me shouting. He would have responded. Unless... No, I couldn't think like that. I forced myself to focus. I had to find Aaron. He couldn't have gone far. Maybe he had just wandered off the trail a little to explore, and I had missed him. I picked up my pace, almost running now, calling his name again and again. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my nerves on edge. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard it. Claire. Aaron's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere off the trail. Relief washed over me, and I spun around, scanning the trees for any sign of him. There, a few yards off the path, I saw him leaning against a tree, his face pale and covered in sweat. Aaron. I ran to him, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. But as I got closer, I saw the blood. His shirt was torn, and there was a deep gash along his ribs, the fabric soaked through with dark, red stains. Oh my God, Aaron. What happened? I knelt beside him, my hands shaking as I pressed them against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. Aaron winced, his face contorted in pain. I don't know, he gasped, his voice weak. I went to get water, and then someone came up behind me. I didn't see them, but I think they had a knife. I felt sick, a cold wave of fear washing over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Someone had attacked him. Someone was still out there. "We need to get you out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Can you walk?" Aaron nodded weakly, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He struggled to stand, leaning heavily on me for support as we stumbled back toward the trail. "Who did this to you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Aaron looked at me, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't see him, but I heard him. He was talking to someone else. They're still out there. My blood ran cold, and I glanced around the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one in sight, but that didn't mean we were alone. "We have to move," I whispered, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. "Now." With Aaron leaning heavily on me, we stumbled back toward the trail, every step feeling like it took an eternity. My legs burned, my heart raced, and all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Somehow, by sheer will and determination, we made it back to the trailhead just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. My car was the only one in the parking lot, and I practically dragged Aaron the last few feet to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if someone was there, watching us from the shadows. When we finally made it into the car and sped down the road, I could barely breathe. My mind raced with everything that had happened, every detail replaying over and over in my head. I didn't know who those people were or what they had wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. We had gotten lucky, and I wasn't going back. I've always been the type to seek solace in the wilderness. Something about being completely detached from the noise of the world, no buzzing phones, no traffic, no crowds, just me and nature. I had camped alone plenty of times before, so this trip wasn't out of the ordinary. I had found an isolated spot in the woods that wasn't too far from the main trail, but remote enough that I wouldn't run into many people. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees as I finished setting up my tent. The sky glowed in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It was one of those perfect evenings, cool but not cold, with a soft breeze that made the leaves rustle just enough to create that ambient forest music I loved. I was just about to light a fire when I heard the distant murmur of voices. They were faint at first, but clear enough to know that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. For a moment, I considered packing up and moving to a different spot. After all, part of the reason I chose this location was for the solitude, but I decided against it. Maybe they were just passing through. A few minutes later, I saw them 5 people, 2 women and 3 men, all in their 20s or 30s. They emerged from the trees just beyond the clearing where I had set up camp. From the looks of their large packs, they were prepared for a long night outdoors. They didn't see me at first, so I called out, not wanting to seem like I was spying on them. "Hey there," I waved from my spot by the fire pit. All 5 of them turned at once, their movements strangely synchronized. For a second, none of them spoke, just stared at me, as if they hadn't expected to see anyone else this far into the woods. The moment stretched out uncomfortably before one of the men. The tall guy with the scruffy beard stepped forward, smiling. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "Didn't see you there. You camping alone?" I hesitated for a split second, debating whether I should lie. Something about his question felt too direct, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. "Yeah, just here for the night. I like the quiet." The man's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Quiet, huh? Good spot for it," he gestured to the others. "We're camping just over the ridge if you need anything." I nodded, though I wasn't planning on needing anything from them. "Thanks, but I'm all set. Enjoy your night." The man lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning my small campsite, before turning back to his group. They walked off toward the ridge, disappearing into the trees, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. I didn't mind other campers, but something about them had felt off. As night fell, I settled by the fire, poking at the embers and listening to the soft crackle of the flames. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind in the leaves. I could hear the distant murmur of the other campers, though their voices were low and unintelligible, barely carrying on the breeze. The night grew darker, and the firelight flickered in and out, casting long shadows that danced at the edge of the clearing. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. But after a while, something shifted. The sounds from the other camp went silent abruptly. One moment there was the soft hum of their voices, and the next, nothing. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. I glanced toward the ridge where they had set up camp, but I couldn't see their fire anymore. Maybe they turned in early, maybe they were just tired. But a knot of unease began to form in my stomach, a faint whisper of dread that I tried to push aside. I told myself I was being paranoid. Not everyone was out here to socialize. They were probably just enjoying the quiet, the same way I was. But still, the silence was unsettling. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that I had been enjoying earlier. It was the kind of silence that felt deliberate, like it had been created. I threw another log on the fire and tried to shake off the feeling. But the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of something I hadn't noticed before. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, no distant rustling in the underbrush. Just silence. That knot in my stomach tightened. I stood up, stretching my legs, and walked a few paces from the fire, scanning the trees around me. The darkness felt thick, impenetrable, and I had the unsettling sensation of being watched. I laughed at myself, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. I was in the middle of the woods, alone. Of course it felt a little eerie. That was the whole point of camping in a remote spot, wasn't it? But then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, crunching the dry leaves just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The footsteps stopped when I stopped, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. My heart began to pound, adrenaline surging through my veins. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the wind gently rustling the leaves overhead. I waited a few more seconds, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Slowly, I turned back toward the fire, trying to convince myself that it was probably just an animal. But as I sat down again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The fire was starting to die down, and I reached for another log, but stopped when I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack. I flicked it on, sweeping the beam through the trees. Nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone or something was out there watching me. I backed toward the fire, keeping the flashlight trained on the darkness. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. It could be one of the other campers. Maybe they were just messing with me. But why wouldn't they say something? Why wouldn't they show themselves? I decided I wasn't going to wait around to find out. My gut was telling me to leave, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I grabbed my pack and started stuffing my gear inside, my hands shaking as I worked. The footsteps had stopped again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there was still watching me, waiting. I was just about to pack up the last of my things when I heard a voice. "You heading out already?" I spun around, the flashlight beam catching the tall man from earlier scruffy beard, friendly smile standing just at the edge of the clearing. His hands were shoved in his pockets, and he was watching me with that same strange expression, like he knew something I didn't. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just figured I'd head out early." The man took a step closer, his smile never faltering. "No need to rush off. It's a beautiful night. Why don't you stay by the fire for a little longer?" There was something off about his tone, too casual, too friendly, given the circumstances. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. "No, thanks," I said, shouldering my pack. "I think I'm going to head out." The man's smile faded slightly, and for the first time I noticed how dark his eyes were, almost too dark, like there was something lurking behind them, something dangerous. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice lower now, more insistent. "You don't want to stay with us? We've got plenty of room." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around, half expecting to see the rest of his group lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. Just him. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Yeah, I'm sure," I said, forcing myself to stay calm. "Thanks, though." I turned, ready to leave, but the man stepped forward, blocking my path. "Come on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "It's not safe out there alone." My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back, my mind racing. There was no reason for him to be this insistent. No reason for him to care whether I stayed or left. Unless... "I'll be fine," I said, my voice shaking. The man's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, the mask of friendliness slipped. His expression hardened, his mouth twisting into something far less welcoming. "I think you should stay." That was it. The final warning. I didn't care what he wanted or why he was trying to keep me there. I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I pushed past him, my heart racing as I broke into a run, heading for the trail. I didn't look back, but I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast, closing the distance between us. "Hey," he shouted after me, his voice sharp, no longer friendly. "Get back here." But I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning with the effort, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. The trail was barely visible in the dim light, but I didn't care. All I cared about was putting as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I could still hear him behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, but they were growing fainter. He wasn't as fast as I was. Or maybe he wasn't trying as hard. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my car parked just where I had left it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. But there was nothing, just the empty parking lot and the dark, silent trees. I started the engine and peeled out of there, not looking back until I was miles down the road, the dark forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. Only then did I allow myself to breathe again. Whatever that man's intentions were, I didn't care. All I knew was that I had gotten out of there in time, and I wasn't ever going back. I had always been careful when I camped alone. I wasn't reckless or looking for a thrill, I just liked the solitude, the peace of being away from the world. It was my way of clearing my head, of finding some quiet in an otherwise noisy life. So when I found the perfect spot deep in the woods, a little clearing with a great view of the trees and a small stream nearby, I thought I had hit the jackpot. It was an area that wasn't on any map or part of any marked trail, and that's exactly what I wanted, total isolation. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car near the edge of a Forest Service road, and hiked about an hour into the wilderness. By the time I set up my tent and gathered some firewood, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow through the canopy of leaves overhead. The first sign of something wrong didn't come until I started clearing the ground for my fire pit. As I was pulling up some rocks to make a ring, I noticed something shiny, half hidden under a pile of leaves. At first I thought it was just a piece of litter, maybe a beer can left behind by someone passing through. But when I bent down to pick it up, I realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a small camera. It wasn't one of those older bulky models either. It was a sleek modern camera, the kind you'd use for filming or security. It had no case or mount, just lying there on the ground, pointing directly at where I was setting up camp. The lens was partially buried in the dirt, but the red light on the side was blinking, indicating that it was still on and recording. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there for a moment, staring at the camera, trying to make sense of it. Why would there be a camera out here, in the middle of nowhere? And why was it pointed directly at this clearing? My first thought was that maybe it belonged to a wildlife enthusiast or a park ranger, but it didn't make sense. This wasn't a popular spot, and the camera wasn't set up to monitor any trails or wildlife. I picked it up, dusted off the lens, and turned it over in my hands. It was small, barely the size of my palm, and there were no distinguishing marks on it, no brand name, no labels. Just a sleek, black device that looked disturbingly out of place in the wilderness. That feeling of isolation I had craved was suddenly replaced by something else, something darker. I felt exposed, like I was being watched, even though I was sure I was alone. I glanced around the clearing, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the quiet stillness of the forest. I considered turning around and hiking back to my car right then and there. But I pushed the thought aside. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just a coincidence. Maybe someone had lost the camera while they were hiking, or maybe it had fallen from a drone. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. I put the camera in my pack and went back to clearing the fire pit, but my mind kept wandering back to it. The blinking red light, the way it had been pointed so precisely at my campsite, it didn't feel like an accident. I had just started stacking the firewood when I noticed something else. Another camera. This one was mounted on a tree about 20 feet from my tent, partially hidden behind a tangle of branches. It was angled down toward the clearing, positioned to capture the entire area. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had placed these cameras here deliberately, and they were watching. I backed up slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There had to be more cameras, I realized. How else could they monitor this spot so thoroughly? My heart began to race as the paranoia set in. Who had placed these cameras? Why were they here? And more importantly, were they watching me right now? I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I quickly grabbed my pack, stuffing the camera I had found earlier into one of the side pockets. My fingers were trembling as I zipped it up, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this some kind of prank? A joke? Or was it something more sinister? As I slung my pack over my shoulders, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped. It wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, just beyond the line of trees that bordered the clearing. I froze, listening intently, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the leaves. Then I heard it again. A faint, deliberate crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone was out there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought the urge to run. Running would make noise, would draw attention. Whoever was out there, if they were watching, would know I had found the cameras. They might know I was about to leave. I needed to move quietly. I started walking slowly, carefully placing each footstep to avoid making noise. I headed toward the trail that led back to my car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me, staying just out of sight. I hadn't gone more than 50 yards when I saw another camera, hidden behind a cluster of ferns. This one was smaller than the others, almost invisible against the dark green foliage. My stomach churned as I realized just how thorough they had been. They were watching everything, whoever they were. I reached for my phone, intending to call the police, but when I checked the screen, my stomach dropped. No service. Of course. I was miles away from the nearest town, deep in the woods with no cell signal. I cursed under my breath and shoved the phone back in my pocket. My pace quickened, my mind racing. I didn't care about my gear anymore, I could replace it. All I wanted was to get back to my car, to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I couldn't hear any more footsteps, but I knew deep in my gut that someone was there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. The cameras were just the beginning. By the time I reached the spot where the trail met the road, I was practically running. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My car was parked just where I had left it, hidden behind a thick patch of trees. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. When I finally managed to open it, I threw my pack into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods, but there was no one. Just the quiet, still forest, the same as before. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, driving as fast as I could without looking back. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I didn't care. All I cared about was getting as far away from those woods as possible. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, back on the highway, that I allowed myself to breathe again. My mind raced with everything that had happened, the cameras, the footsteps, the strange, oppressive silence that had settled over the woods. None of it made sense. And then I remembered the camera in my pack. When I reached a gas station, I pulled over and took it out, turning it over in my hands. The blinking red light was still on, the lens still trained on me. I shuddered and placed it on the passenger seat, staring at it like it was some sort of cursed object. Should I go to the police? I wasn't sure. What would I even tell them? That I found a few cameras in the woods. They would probably brush it off, tell me it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I knew that. I turned the camera over and opened the small panel on the side. Inside was an SD card, barely visible in the dim light of the gas station. My fingers trembled as I slid it out and held it up to the light. What was on it? I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know who had been watching me, who had been following me. I drove to the nearest town and found a small motel, pulling into the parking lot and booking a room for the night. As soon as I was inside, I grabbed my laptop and slid the SD card into the slot. It took a few moments to load, and my heart raced as I waited. When the files finally appeared on the screen, there were dozens of them, dozens of videos, all labeled with timestamps. I clicked on the first one. The video was grainy but clear enough. It showed the clearing where I had set up camp. The trees, the rocks, the fire pit. It was empty, just the forest, quiet and still. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching as the sun set and the sky grew darker. Still nothing. No movement, no sound. But then, in the middle of the night, the camera caught something. A figure barely visible moving through the trees. It wasn't me. I was in my tent. This was someone else, someone moving silently through the clearing, crouching low to the ground. I paused the video, my stomach lurching. The figure was holding something. Another camera. I fast-forwarded again, watching in horror as the figure moved around the clearing, placing cameras in various spots near the fire pit, by the trees, all pointed toward my tent. I felt sick. The video continued for hours, the figure disappearing into the woods, only to return several times throughout the night. They never approached my tent, but they were always there, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching. The last video was from the morning. It showed me packing up my things, getting ready to leave. The camera captured everything, my every movement, my every glance toward the trees. And then, just as I was about to leave, the figure appeared again. This time they were closer, much closer. It's hard to explain what really happened that day. I've thought about it 100 times, replaying the events over and over in my head, but no matter how many times I try, it doesn't make sense. What happened to me out there wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. And sometimes I wonder if it was real at all. It started off like any other hike. A short trip, nothing serious. I'd done the trail plenty of times before, and it wasn't particularly challenging. The woods were beautiful, especially in the early fall when the leaves were turning shades of amber and gold. I'd packed enough water for the afternoon, a couple of snacks, and my phone for music and pictures. I didn't need a map because I knew the area well, or at least I thought I did. The trail was quiet, which was just the way I liked it. No other hikers, no noise from nearby roads, just the sounds of nature. It had been a stressful week at work, and I was looking forward to a few hours of peace. I planned to reach a lookout point about 3 miles in, sit down for a while, enjoy the view, and head back before dark. I set out early in the afternoon with the sun hanging high in the sky. Everything seemed normal for the first mile or two. The trail wound through the forest, the ground covered in fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path, disappearing into the underbrush. I felt calm, centered, exactly the way I'd hoped. But then things started to get strange. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but at some point the forest changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I didn't even notice right away. The light filtering through the trees became dimmer, even though it was still early afternoon. The sounds of the forest, the birds, the rustling of leaves faded away until there was nothing but an eerie, oppressive silence. I stopped in the middle of the trail, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. No wind, no movement, just stillness. My skin prickled, and I turned slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of life. But there was nothing. The woods were empty. A feeling of unease settled over me, but I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I'd been stressed lately, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I kept walking, picking up the pace a little, eager to reach the lookout point and take a break. But the further I went, the stranger things became. The trail, which I knew like the back of my hand, suddenly seemed different. The trees were thicker, the path narrower, almost as if it was closing in on me. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but the landmarks I usually recognize, certain rocks, clusters of trees, weren't there. It was like the forest had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. I pulled out my phone, intending to check the map, but of course there was no signal. The battery was still at 80%, so I wasn't worried about it dying anytime soon, but the lack of service didn't help my growing unease. Still, I pressed on, convinced I would find the lookout soon. I just needed to keep going. Another half-mile passed, and my unease turned to full-blown anxiety. I should have reached the lookout by now. I should have seen the opening in the trees, the familiar rocky outcrop with its stunning view of the valley below. But there was nothing, just more dense forest, stretching endlessly ahead of me. I stopped again, turning in a slow circle, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Had I missed a turn? Was I on a different trail without realizing it? But that didn't make sense. There were no other trails in this area, just the one that led to the lookout and back. I hadn't strayed off the path, I was sure of it. I checked my phone again, still no signal. The map app was useless without service, so I tucked it back into my pocket and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I was fine, I told myself. I wasn't lost. I just needed to retrace my steps and get back to where the trail felt familiar again. But as soon as I turned around to head back, I froze. The trail behind me was gone. I don't mean that it had faded or become overgrown. I mean it was gone completely. The path I had just walked was no longer there. Instead, there was nothing but thick trees and underbrush, stretching out in every direction as far as I could see. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around again, looking desperately for any sign of the trail, any hint of the path I had been walking just moments before. But there was nothing, no footprints, no trampled leaves, no sign that anyone had walked through this part of the forest at all. Panic set in. I started walking, no longer caring about staying calm or being quiet. My footsteps crashed through the underbrush, leaves and twigs snapping underfoot as I pushed through the trees, trying to find the trail again. But no matter how far I went, the forest didn't change. It was like I was trapped in some kind of maze, each step taking me deeper into the woods without any hope of finding my way out. I pulled out my phone again, my hands trembling. Still no signal. I checked the time, only 2:30 p.m. I had plenty of daylight left, but the forest was so dark, it felt like the sun was already setting. I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me through the thick trees, and the oppressive silence weighed down on me like a heavy blanket. I forced myself to stop and take a deep breath. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think clearly to figure out where I was and how to get back to the main trail. I had been hiking this area for years. I knew these woods, didn't I? But no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just that I was lost. It was like the forest itself had changed around me, like the trees had shifted to trap me inside. I started walking again, this time more cautiously, trying to stay calm. I could feel my heart racing, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I told myself that if I kept going in one direction, I'd eventually find my way back. I just had to keep moving. But the deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees, which had been tall and straight when I first started, were now twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots that seemed to trip me with every step. And the air was colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in on me. My mind raced with 100 thoughts, none of them comforting. Was I really lost? Was I just disoriented or had something else happened? The rational part of my brain told me it was just fear playing tricks on me, but the rest of me wasn't so sure. I had been hiking for over an hour now, and the sun, if it was even still out, was nowhere to be seen. The dim light that filtered through the trees was growing weaker, and I knew I didn't have much time before it got too dark to see. I pulled out my phone one last time, praying for a signal. Nothing. That was when I heard a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep in the woods behind me. A voice. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice calling my name. Alex. It was faint, barely audible over the silence of the forest, but it was there. Someone was out there. Someone who knew my name. Alex. The voice was louder now, closer, and my heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. Someone was looking for me. Someone knew I was out here. Relief flooded through me, and I started moving toward the sound, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. Alex, where are you? It was a man's voice, though I couldn't place it. I didn't care. All that mattered was that someone had found me. I'm here, I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. I'm over here. I started running, crashing through the trees, the voice guiding me, pulling me toward safety. I didn't care about the twisted branches or the uneven ground anymore. All I cared about was reaching the person who was calling my name. But as I got closer, something felt off. The voice, it wasn't quite right. It was familiar, but not in the way I expected. It was as if someone was mimicking a voice I knew, but didn't fully understand how to sound human. Alex. The voice was right in front of me now, just beyond the next row of trees. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, a deep primal fear taking hold of me. I knew that voice, but it wasn't possible. Alex. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. It was my voice. Someone or something was calling my name in my own voice. I stumbled back, my mind ailing, the realization hitting me like a cold wave. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from that voice, from whatever was out there in the woods. My feet pounded the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tore through the forest, branches whipping at my face and arms. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, my legs burning with exhaustion, my lungs screaming for air. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, the silence of the forest pressing in around me. The voice was gone, but I wasn't safe. I knew that now. Whatever had been calling my name, whatever had been following me, it wasn't human. It wasn't natural. I don't know how long I sat there, too terrified to move, but eventually the sky began to lighten. The oppressive darkness that had surrounded me for hours seemed to lift, and for the first time since I had gotten lost, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face. I stood, my legs shaking, and began to walk. This time the forest seemed different. The trees were familiar again, the trail clear and easy to follow. Within half an hour, I was back at the trailhead, my car parked just where I had left it. But I never looked back. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan on going back. Whatever happened to me out there, whatever was calling my name, it wasn't something I want to face again. There's a certain kind of loneliness you can only find deep in the woods. It's the kind that seeps into your bones, that makes you hyper aware of how small and insignificant you are in the grand scheme of things. I'd always enjoyed that kind of solitude, the kind that clears your mind and makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. That's why I loved hiking alone. This trip, however, was different. It started out just like any other, an early morning drive out to a national forest that I had never visited before. I like to explore new trails, find places where I could be completely isolated from the noise of the city and the distractions of modern life. This forest was supposed to be particularly remote, and that was exactly what I wanted. By mid-morning, I had parked at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set out. The trail wound through thick woods, the air cool and crisp, with a light breeze rustling the leaves overhead. The sun was high, casting dappled patches of light on the forest floor, and everything felt perfect, peaceful. I hiked for hours, losing myself in the rhythm of my footsteps and the steady hum of the forest. Every so often, I'd stop to take in the view, old, towering trees, endless stretches of green, and not a single person in sight. It was just me and the wilderness, the way I liked it. At least that's how it felt at first. By the time the sun started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the trail, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of civilization for miles. No trail markers, no other hikers, not even a stray piece of litter. Normally, this would have been a good thing, but something about the absolute isolation began to feel oppressive. I pushed the feeling aside and kept moving, figuring I'd make camp soon. I had enough supplies to last me through the night, and I planned to head back in the morning. But as I walked, the feeling that something wasn't quite right grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a strange quietness in the forest, the way the wind had died down completely, leaving the woods eerily still. The birds had stopped singing, and even the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush had disappeared. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. I paused in the middle of the trail, listening. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under my boots as I shifted my weight. I glanced around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the long shadows and the fading light. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and I slowly turned in a circle, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for the source of the feeling. But the forest was empty. No figures hiding in the shadows, no movement among the trees, just stillness. I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. It was probably just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods, far from anyone or anything. Of course, I was going to feel a little uneasy. But as I continued walking, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Every step I took felt like it was being tracked, like someone or something was watching my every move. My pace quickened, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced I'd see someone standing behind me. But there was never anyone there. By the time I found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun had almost completely set, and the woods were bathed in the dim, fading light of dusk. I quickly set up my tent, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. The sensation of being watched had intensified to the point where I could barely focus. It felt like eyes were on me from every direction, hidden just beyond the tree line, waiting. Once the tent was up, I built a small fire, hoping it would provide some comfort, some sense of security. The flames flickered weakly in the cooling night air, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of the clearing. I sat down by the fire, trying to calm my racing heart, telling myself that I was safe, that I was alone. But I didn't feel alone. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The feeling of being watched pressed down on me like a weight, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't shake the thought that there was something out there, just beyond the firelight, hiding in the darkness, watching. I tried to distract myself, rummaging through my pack for something to eat, but the feeling only grew stronger. My eyes kept flicking toward the shadows, my ears straining to catch any sound, any hint of movement. But there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the oppressive silence of the woods. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, scanning the tree line, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. The only response was the crackle of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it. I sat back down, my pulse racing, my hands trembling. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had camped alone plenty of times before. There was no reason to be scared now. But as the night wore on, the feeling didn't go away. It only got worse. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up with a start, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The clearing was bathed in complete darkness now, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. For a moment, I sat there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest crunch of leaves underfoot. It was close, too close. My heart leapt into my throat, and I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees just beyond the clearing, but there was nothing, no one. I swept the light back and forth, my pulse pounding in my ears, but the woods were empty. And yet, I could still feel it. That oppressive, suffocating sensation of being watched. It was so strong now, it was almost unbearable. My skin crawled, and I fought the urge to run, to grab my things and get the hell out of there. But something told me not to move. Something told me that if I ran, it would follow. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand as I swept it over the trees again and again, searching for the source of the feeling. Then, just for a second, I saw it. A figure, barely visible at the edge of the light, standing motionless among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, thin limbs and a face obscured by shadow. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, the figure was gone. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what I had seen or if I had seen anything at all, but I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I scrambled to pack up my things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my pack. The fire was almost completely out now, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the feeling that something was waiting, watching. When my pack was finally ready, I grabbed it and stood up, glancing one last time toward the trees. My flashlight flickered weakly, the batteries already beginning to die. Then I heard it again. The soft, deliberate crunch of leaves, coming from just beyond the clearing. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran. The darkness closed in around me as I sprinted down the trail, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. My breath came in ragged gasps and my legs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out of the woods. Behind me, I could hear the faint, rhythmic crunch of footsteps following me, keeping pace. It wasn't close, but it was there, steady, relentless. I ran faster, my lungs screaming for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees blurred past me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I didn't know how long I ran, minutes, hours. But eventually I saw the faint glow of the trailhead up ahead, my car parked just where I had left it. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely able to carry me anymore. When I finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly unlock the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long time, I just sat there, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't look back. I didn't check the rearview mirror. I couldn't. When I finally started the car and pulled onto the road, I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look into the darkness behind me. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know if it was real or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. The hike had started like any other planned overnight trek with my best friend, Jeremy, in one of the more remote sections of the national forest. We'd done countless trips like this, both of us avid hikers who enjoyed the escape of the outdoors. No phones, no distractions, just nature. It was supposed to be a straightforward 2-day hike with a simple loop, that would take us through the thickest parts of the forest and end up back at our car by the second afternoon. The trailhead had been deserted when we arrived, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. It was just after dawn, the sun barely peeking over the treetops, casting long shadows through the dense underbrush. Jeremy and I parked the car, strapped on our packs, and set out, our boots crunching the gravel of the trail. We were in high spirits, laughing, joking, and excited about the isolation that the deep woods would offer. Everything seemed normal at first. We hiked for a few hours, making good time, the trail winding deeper into the wilderness. We passed through groves of towering pines, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot, and crossed a few small streams. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, and for a while everything felt right. But things started to change around midday. We had stopped for lunch at a small clearing, a patch of sunlight breaking through the thick canopy. The air was cooler than I expected for early autumn, but I brushed it off. As we ate, Jeremy kept glancing over his shoulder, his face scrunched up in confusion. You hear that he asked, cocking his head to the side, listening intently. I paused, listening carefully, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. Just the wind rustling the leaves and the distant call of birds. No, what do you hear? He frowned. It's probably nothing. I thought I heard footsteps, like someone was walking through the woods just beyond the trees. I scanned the tree line, my gaze sweeping the dense foliage around us. But there was no sign of anyone, and we hadn't seen a single person since we'd left the car. I don't see anyone, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Maybe it's just an animal. Jeremy nodded, but he didn't look convinced. I noticed he kept glancing around for the rest of lunch, his eyes darting toward the trees like he was expecting something or someone to appear at any moment. When we finished eating, we packed up and continued down the trail, but the atmosphere had shifted. The easygoing banter we'd shared earlier had disappeared, replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. Jeremy was on edge, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I could feel it too. The forest, once lively and inviting, felt different now, darker, quieter. We hadn't gone more than an hour past the clearing when things took a turn for the worse. Jeremy stopped suddenly in the middle of the trail, holding up a hand to signal for me to stop too. His eyes were wide, and his face had gone pale. "Do you hear it now?" he whispered. I froze, listening intently. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, but after a few seconds, I caught it faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, coming from somewhere off the trail. They weren't close, but they weren't far either, and they were unmistakably human. My heart rate spiked, and I turned toward the direction of the sound, my eyes scanning the thick trees. "Do you think someone's out there?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jeremy didn't respond right away. He was staring into the woods, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't know. It sounds like they're circling us, though, keeping their distance." The footsteps stopped, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. "Maybe it's another hiker," I suggested, though the words felt hollow. We hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead, and this part of the forest was too remote for casual day hikers. Jeremy shook his head again. "No, something's off." We stood there for a few more seconds, neither of us speaking, straining to hear any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. Jeremy finally turned to me, his face grim. "Let's keep moving. We'll pick up the pace, and if we see or hear anything else, we'll figure it out then." I nodded, my heart still racing, and we set off again, walking faster now, our eyes darting nervously to the trees on either side of the trail. The sense of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified with every step we took. The forest had become unnervingly quiet, the sounds of wildlife growing more and more distant, until there was nothing but the crunch of our boots on the trail and the occasional snap of a twig from somewhere deep in the woods. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. We hiked for another hour, maybe more, the light starting to fade as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The plan had been to camp by a small lake a few miles from the trailhead, but as we walked, I wasn't so sure I wanted to stay the night anymore. The footsteps returned just as we rounded a bend in the trail. This time, they were louder, closer. They echoed through the trees, coming from every direction at once. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. Jeremy stopped too, his head whipping around as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice steady but loud. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Jeremy turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to move. Now." We didn't run, but we might as well have. We hiked as fast as we could without breaking into a full sprint, the sense of urgency building with every step. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just some hiker playing a prank, or maybe someone was lost and didn't know how to approach us. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. The sun had dipped below the tree line by the time we reached the lake. The water, usually calm and serene, looked dark and foreboding in the fading light. Jeremy didn't say anything, just dropped his pack by the shore and started setting up camp. His hands were shaking. I wanted to ask him what he thought was happening, but I couldn't find the words. We worked in silence, quickly setting up the tent and gathering enough wood for a small fire. The whole time I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone or something step out of the shadows. Once the fire was lit, we sat down on opposite sides of the flames, the crackling wood, the only sound in the oppressive silence. The tension between us was palpable, neither of us wanting to voice our fears. It was Jeremy who finally broke the silence. "We should have seen someone by now," he said, staring into the fire. "If it's another hiker, they'd have come out of the trees. They'd have said something." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. "Do you think it's..." I paused, unsure of what I was even asking. "Do you think we're being followed?" Jeremy didn't respond right away. He just stared at the fire, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I think so, but I don't know why." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the firelight, but there was nothing. Then, as if on cue, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer than ever, barely 50 feet from our camp, echoing through the trees like the slow, deliberate approach of someone who didn't care if they were heard. I shot to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. Jeremy. But when I turned to look at him, he wasn't there. The spot where he had been sitting moments ago was empty, the space between us marked only by the flickering flames of the fire. "Jeremy," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the footsteps, still circling the camp, growing louder with every second. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No sign of Jeremy. No sign of anyone. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled toward the tent, calling his name again and again. Jeremy, where are you? Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 1 minute, Jeremy had been there, sitting across from me by the fire, and the next, he was gone, vanished without a trace. I kept searching, circling the camp, shouting his name until my voice was hoarse, but there was no response. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. The footsteps had stopped, too. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to dial for help, but there was no signal, no way to contact anyone, no way to find out what had happened to Jeremy. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, waiting for the footsteps to return, waiting for some sign of Jeremy. But the woods remained silent, the oppressive stillness suffocating me. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't bother taking down the tent or packing up the rest of our gear. I just ran down the trail, through the trees, not stopping until I reached the car. I never found Jeremy. When I finally got to a town with cell service and called for help, the search party didn't find him either. They found the camp, found our gear, but there was no sign of him. No tracks, no evidence that he had left the campsite at all. It was like he had vanished. The official report said he was missing, presumed dead. A tragic accident, they called it. But I knew better. I knew he hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken him, something that had been following us since that afternoon in the woods. I still hear the footsteps sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet, I'll hear them slow, deliberate, echoing in my mind. And I'll remember that day. The day Jeremy vanished. I wasn't new to camping, but this trip was different. I was alone this time. Normally I'd camp with friends, but life had gotten busy and people had other commitments. Still, I needed the escape. Work had been brutal, and the daily grind had taken its toll on me. I figured a few days out in nature would do the trick. I had always felt a sense of peace out in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. So I packed my gear, picked a remote campground, and headed out. The site I chose was one of those isolated, nearly forgotten places. It wasn't on any well-traveled trail, and there were no signs leading up to it. I had to park my car on a gravel road and hike a couple of miles in, but that's what I wanted, complete solitude. When I arrived, it was already late afternoon, the golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The campsite was perfect. There was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a creek nearby for fresh water, and not a soul in sight. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I set up my tent quickly, eager to settle in before the sun disappeared behind the hills. Once my camp was ready, I built a fire, the crackle of the flames mixing with the quiet sounds of the forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine needles thick and comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I ate dinner by the fire, enjoying the peace that the woods always brought me. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows lengthened, I leaned back against a tree, staring up at the stars starting to blink into existence. Everything felt right. But then, after a while, the silence became too silent. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant animals moving about faded, leaving behind an eerie stillness. At first, I didn't notice, too lost in my thoughts, but eventually the unnatural quiet began to sink in. I sat up, glancing around, my senses suddenly alert. It was strange. The forest always had a rhythm, even at night. You'd hear the soft breeze, the occasional bird, or the crack of a twig. But now there was nothing, just the steady crackle of my fire, which now felt oddly out of place. I brushed it off as the natural lull of the evening. Maybe the animals had just gone to bed, and the wind had died down. Still, that prickling feeling of unease settled in the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I glanced into the trees beyond the firelight, half expecting to see anything move in the darkness. But the woods were still, just shadows and silhouettes of trees standing tall and unmoving. I sighed and tried to relax, telling myself I was overthinking things. But as the night grew deeper, that feeling only grew stronger. The quiet had transformed from peaceful to oppressive, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my eyes kept darting to the dark edges of the clearing, scanning for movement. And then, I heard it. A soft rustling sound, barely audible, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I froze, listening, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped. I stared into the darkness, straining my eyes to see beyond the dim glow of the fire, but I couldn't make out anything. The forest was thick, the trees and brush forming an impenetrable wall of shadows. Maybe it was just an animal. That's what I told myself. A deer or a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But the unease didn't go away. My mind kept going back to how quiet everything had been. And that rustling. It sounded too deliberate, too careful, like someone was trying to move without being noticed. I tried to shake it off. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest person. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The idea of someone sneaking through the woods, watching me, was ridiculous. But the feeling wouldn't leave. The fire was starting to die down, the flames shrinking into glowing embers, and I knew I needed to add more wood. I stood up, the sudden movement sending a jolt of adrenaline through me, and grabbed a few logs from the pile. As I bent to place them on the fire, I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. My hand froze mid-motion, and I slowly stood back up, staring into the trees. The sound had been brief, just a soft crunch of leaves or a branch snapping underfoot, but it was enough to set every nerve in my body on edge. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence. I waited, listening intently, but there was no response. Just the faint crackle of the fire and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I turned slowly, scanning the perimeter of the camp, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. I tried to tell myself again that it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I tossed the logs onto the fire, the flames leaping back to life, and sat back down, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my chest. The firelight pushed back the darkness a little, but it didn't make me feel any safer. As the minutes ticked by, I forced myself to focus on the warmth of the fire, the rhythmic crackling of the wood. But that feeling, that oppressive, lurking presence never left. I felt like I was being watched. After a while, I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I was alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. Of course I felt uneasy. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, something happened that I couldn't explain. I had been staring into the fire, trying to lose myself in the flickering flames, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a subtle shift, a slight movement at the edge of the clearing. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the darkness beyond them. But then I noticed it barely visible, but unmistakable. A shadow darker than the rest, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was standing there, watching me. I stared at the figure, frozen in place, my mind racing. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette, still and silent. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to say something, to call out, but the words wouldn't come. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I blinked, my heart racing, unsure of what I had just seen. Had someone really been there, or had my mind played a trick on me? The fire flickered again, casting strange, distorted shadows across the clearing, and I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. No, I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. Someone was watching me. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight trembling in my hand, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but none of them had answers. Finally, I forced myself to take a deep breath and sat back down by the fire, my eyes still scanning the tree line, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, clutching the flashlight, my gaze locked on the shadows just beyond the light, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing happened. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands still shaking from the lingering fear. I didn't care about breakfast or taking down my tent properly. I just needed to leave. The moment the sun's rays hit the forest, I started walking, eager to put as much distance between myself and that campsite as possible. As I hiked back to my car, the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I looked back, I half expected to see someone standing there, watching me from the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty trail and the thick, silent woods. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine, and I peeled out of the parking lot without looking back. I haven't been camping alone since that night. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with me. I don't know if it was a person or something else entirely. All I know is that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. The campsite had been empty for days. At least that's what the ranger at the station told me. He wasn't too concerned. People often hiked in, set up camp, and decided they wanted to move somewhere else. Sometimes they left their stuff, figuring they'd come back for it later. The ranger had mentioned this campsite because it was one of the more remote spots in the forest, and I wanted somewhere quiet off the beaten path, away from the crowds. After a stressful week at work, I was craving isolation. I wanted to be surrounded by nothing but trees, the wind, and the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. I'd spent weeks planning the trip, checking weather forecasts, and going over trail maps. When I finally parked my car and started the hike. I was looking forward to 2 days of solitude, far from the noise of civilization. The hike to the campsite took about 3 hours. The trail was narrow and overgrown, which was exactly what I wanted, proof that not many people came this way. It was late afternoon when I finally broke through the thick trees and found a small clearing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the soft murmur of a nearby stream added a calming undertone to the quiet. But then I saw it. The abandoned campsite. It wasn't much at first glance, just an old tent, the canvas faded and sagging, with a few scattered supplies tossed around haphazardly. The fire pit was cold, untouched for days, the charred remnants of logs long forgotten. I paused, studying the scene, unsure of what to make of it. The ranger had mentioned that someone had been camping here recently, but this looked like it had been left much longer than recently. The tent was in poor condition, and the supplies looked like they had been left behind in a hurry. Open cans of food, a rusted kettle, even a sleeping bag spilling out of the tent's opening. I walked closer, my boots crunching softly on the pine needles, my eyes scanning the area. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, just emptiness. Whoever had been here hadn't taken the time to pack up, and that struck me as odd. Even if they had left in a hurry, why abandon so much? As I approached the tent, I saw more signs of neglect. A camp chair knocked over, a flashlight half buried in the dirt, its batteries long dead. The tent flap was unzipped, hanging open, as if someone had left in the middle of the night and hadn't bothered to close it behind them. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and peered inside. The inside of the tent was worse than the outside. The sleeping bag was crumpled, half inside and half out, as if someone had kicked it off in a rush. A few empty water bottles were scattered across the floor, along with a pair of hiking boots, their laces still tied. It looked like someone had simply walked away, leaving everything behind. A chill crept up my spine. I stood up quickly, my eyes darting around the clearing, suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. The sound of the stream seemed too far away now, too distant. The wind had stilled, and the trees loomed tall and dark around me, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. People abandoned campsites all the time. Maybe they got lost and couldn't find their way back. Or maybe they had a family emergency and had to leave in a rush. There were a dozen reasons why someone would leave their gear behind. Still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I backed away from the tent and walked over to where I planned to set up my own camp, further from the abandoned site. The clearing was large enough for me to have some distance, and I figured if I avoided the old campsite, I could still enjoy my night. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting the first hints of twilight over the forest. As I worked to set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing back at the old campsite, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods, but there was nothing. Just the tent, sagging in the dimming light, a silent reminder of whoever had once been here. Once my tent was up, I built a small fire, trying to focus on the tasks at hand. The flames flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows that danced at the edges of the clearing. The fire's warmth helped ease some of the unease, and I settled in, eating a quick meal and sipping water from my canteen. But no matter how hard I tried to relax, my eyes kept drifting back to the abandoned campsite. It was as if the tent itself was watching me, waiting. By the time the sun had fully set and the stars began to peek through the canopy, the fire was the only source of light in the clearing. The air had grown colder, and the sounds of the forest had faded into a heavy silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. And then, in the distance, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but the darkness revealed nothing. Maybe it was an animal. That's what I told myself. A deer or a raccoon, wandering through the woods. But the footsteps had sounded too deliberate, too human. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shone it toward the old campsite. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the sagging tent and the scattered supplies. Everything was as it had been. No movement. No sign of life. I slowly lowered the flashlight and sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself again that it was nothing, just my imagination getting the best of me. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all. There was no one out here. But as the night wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The fire was beginning to die down, the embers glowing dimly in the darkness, when I heard it again this time, much closer. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly through the leaves and underbrush. My heart leapt into my throat, and I jumped to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and flicking it on. The beam swept through the trees, illuminating the darkness, but there was no one. Just the empty woods, silent and still. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I knew what I had heard. Someone or something was out there. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. I waited, listening, but the footsteps had stopped. The forest was quiet again, unnaturally quiet. I turned back toward my fire, my mind racing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just an animal, or the sound of the fire playing tricks on my ears. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I sat back down by the fire, the flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me from the shadows just beyond the light of the flames. As the minutes passed, the feeling grew stronger until it was almost suffocating. Every instinct of my body was screaming at me to leave, to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. Not yet. The fire was nearly out now, and I knew I needed more wood if I wanted to keep it going through the night. But the thought of leaving the circle of light, even for a moment, terrified me. I stood up, glancing around one last time, and made a quick decision. I grabbed my pack, stuffed my sleeping bag inside, and began breaking down my tent as fast as I could. My hands were trembling, and every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't staying here. Not tonight. Once my tent was packed, I tossed my gear into my backpack, slung it over my shoulders, and grabbed the flashlight. I glanced one last time toward the old campsite, the tent barely visible in the darkness, before turning and heading toward the trail. But as I took my first step, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, coming from the direction of the old campsite. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the clearing, and for the briefest moment, I saw a figure standing just beside the abandoned tent. It was dark, its features obscured by shadow, but it was unmistakably human. And it was watching me. My heart nearly stopped, and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, sprinting through the forest, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My feet pounded the earth, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The footsteps followed me for a while, slow and steady, keeping pace just out of sight. But after a few minutes, they stopped, and the forest was silent again. By the time I reached my car, I was gasping for breath, my legs burning with exhaustion. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped behind the wheel, and started the engine without a second thought. As I sped down the dirt road, away from the forest, I couldn't shake the image of the figure by the tent the way it had stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I don't know what happened to the person who had left that campsite. I don't know if they ever came back for their things. But I do know one thing. Something was still out there. And it was waiting. I had always loved the mountains. Something about the towering peaks, the crisp air, and the vast expanse of wilderness made me feel like I could breathe easier. The world was simpler up there, quieter, more peaceful. That's why I decided to spend the weekend hiking solo in the remote highlands of a national park. It was a bit of a drive, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be alone to leave behind the daily grind and just lose myself in the serenity of nature. The trail I chose was relatively unknown, not marked on the official park maps. I had found it on an old forum for experienced hikers who sought solitude and adventure. It was challenging but rewarding, and most importantly, far from the crowds that typically populated more popular trails. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the mountains. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot, which was exactly what I had hoped for. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and set out, eager to reach a good spot to camp before nightfall. The trail was tough, just as I expected, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. I hiked steadily for a few hours, watching the sun dip lower behind the mountain peaks, until I reached a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. It was the perfect spot to set up camp isolated, quiet, and with an incredible vantage point to watch the sunset. I set up my tent quickly, the fading light signaling the fast approaching night. Once my camp was ready, I sat on a rock near the edge of the plateau, sipping water and taking in the breathtaking view. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving the sky streaked with brilliant colors, deep oranges, purples, and pinks. The air was cool and fresh, and for the first time in what felt like months, I felt at peace. As the stars began to twinkle above, I lit a small fire, its warm glow illuminating the rocky ground around me. I wasn't planning on staying up too late. I had an early start planned for the next day to explore more of the rugged terrain. But for now, I was content just sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Just a few small, flickering pinpricks of light, far off in the distance, at the base of the mountain. I squinted, leaning forward to get a better look, but they were so far away that I couldn't make out much detail. Maybe they were from a distant town, or from other hikers far below. The lights blinked and shimmered in a way that was almost hypnotic. I shrugged it off, figuring it was nothing unusual, and returned my attention to the fire. But as the minutes passed, the lights began to move. I froze, watching as the faint glimmers of light slowly shifted, moving in a deliberate pattern. They weren't stationary anymore. They were rising, climbing the mountain, making their way toward me. My first thought was that they were other hikers, maybe with headlamps or flashlights, making their way up the same trail I had taken. But something about the way the lights moved didn't seem right. They were too smooth, too fluid, like they were floating rather than bouncing with the rhythm of walking. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I stood up, walking closer to the edge of the plateau, my eyes fixed on the lights as they continued their steady ascent. There were more of them now, at least 5 or 6, flickering softly in the distance, getting closer by the minute. I glanced down the trail, half expecting to see other campers or hikers emerging from the trees. But the path behind me was empty, and the forest was eerily silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the soft crackle of my fire and the distant hum of the wind. The lights kept climbing. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, shining the beam down the trail. The powerful light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky path below, but there was nothing. No movement, no hikers, just the empty trail stretching down into the darkness. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't other hikers. I could feel it in my gut. I stood there for a few more moments, staring at the lights as they continued to rise, now less than a mile away. They were moving faster now, too fast for anyone on foot. And they were too high in the air, floating above the ground, weaving through the trees, as if they weren't bound by the laws of gravity. Panic began to creep in, my mind racing with possibilities. Were they drones? But why would anyone be flying drones out here, in the middle of the night, so far from civilization? I turned off my flashlight and backed away from the edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled behind me, but its warmth no longer felt comforting. I couldn't take my eyes off the lights. They were getting closer, how much closer. Within minutes, they were only a few hundred feet away, just beyond the tree line that bordered the plateau. I could see them clearly now, 6 or 7 pale orbs of light, floating silently through the trees. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, hovering effortlessly, their glow faint but steady. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The lights stopped. They hovered just at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, flickering softly like fireflies. But these weren't fireflies. They were too large, too deliberate in their movements. They didn't blink or dart around randomly. They just waited. I stood frozen, staring at the lights, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I had no explanation, no logical reason for why these lights were here or what they were. I thought about calling out, shouting into the darkness to see if there was anyone behind the lights, some person controlling them, playing a prank, anything. But the fear kept my mouth shut. My instincts were screaming at me to stay silent, to stay still. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights began to move again. But this time, they weren't moving up the mountain. They were moving toward me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rock. The lights floated forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. My mind raced, searching for some kind of plan, some way to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. The lights were only 20 feet away now, their glow casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my skin prickling with a strange, electric sensation. I backed up further, my hands trembling, until I felt the heat of the fire at my back. The flames flickered weakly, as if they were being smothered by the presence of the lights. 15 feet. 10 feet. They were almost on top of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, the lights stopped. They hovered there, silent and motionless, their soft glow illuminating the rocks and trees around me. I could see them clearly now, perfectly round orbs of light, each one about the size of a basketball, floating in midair without any visible source or origin. They didn't move. They didn't flicker. They just watched. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the lights, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to stretch out, the world narrowing down to just me and these strange, impossible orbs. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights began to fade. One by one, they dimmed, their glow flickering softly before winking out of existence. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. I stood there, breathless, staring at the spot where the lights had been, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest was silent again, the only sound the soft crackle of the dying fire behind me. I waited, half expecting the lights to return, to reappear from the shadows and resume their slow, deliberate approach. But they didn't. The darkness remained still and empty. After what felt like hours, I finally moved. I stumbled back to my tent, my hands shaking as I unzipped the flap and crawled inside. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. I lay there, curled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me, but the lights never returned. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast or taking in the view. I just grabbed my gear, threw it into my pack, and hiked down the mountain as fast as I could. I never told anyone about the lights. What could I say? That I had been visited by floating orbs of light in the middle of the night, miles from civilization. No one would believe me. Hell, I wasn't. Even sure if I believed it myself. But I know what I saw. And I haven't been back to that mountain since. Camping had always been my way of clearing my head. The woods were my escape from the chaos of everyday life. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the quiet serenity of nature. I usually went with a friend or two, but this time I was alone. It had been a rough few weeks at work, and I needed the solitude to regroup. I had planned a solo weekend trip to a remote spot I had visited a few times before, about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was isolated, quiet, and the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, parked my car, and started the hike. The trail was narrow and wound its way through thick woods, with the occasional break in the trees offering glimpses of the mountains in the distance. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It felt good to be back in nature, away from the constant noise of the city. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. I quickly set up my tent and gathered some firewood, eager to get a fire going before nightfall. The campsite was perfect, completely secluded, with a small stream nearby and a thick wall of trees surrounding the clearing. As the fire crackled to life, I sat back on a log, sipping water from my canteen and letting the warmth of the flames seep into my skin. The sky above had turned a deep purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle against the fading light. Everything was calm. Everything felt right. But then, as the darkness began to settle in, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was just a vague unease, a feeling that something was off. I glanced around the clearing, but there was nothing, just the trees standing tall and still, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when you were camping alone, especially as night fell. The isolation played tricks on your mind. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I poked at the fire, trying to shake off the sense of unease. But every time I looked into the trees, I felt like I was missing something. Like there was someone just out of sight, hiding in the shadows, watching me. I told myself it was nothing. There was no one out here but me. But that didn't stop the prickling feeling at the back of my neck, the constant sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It wasn't until I heard the snap of a twig that my heart leapt into my throat. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound echoed through the quiet night. It had come from just beyond the edge of the clearing, from the thick cluster of trees directly in front of me. I strained my ears, listening, but the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals moving through the brush. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. Just the stillness of the night. I stood up slowly, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had heard the sound. My hands were shaking slightly as I flicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I swept the light back and forth, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. No figure hiding in the shadows, no animal darting between the trees, just nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon, something moving through the brush. Nothing to worry about. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, my body tense, my ears straining to pick up any other sounds. The forest was unnervingly quiet now, the usual night sounds of the woods absent. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. As the minutes ticked by, I began to relax just a little. I hadn't heard anything else, and the figure I had been imagining in the trees hadn't appeared. I told myself I was being silly, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was beginning to settle back into my seat, I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, a figure stood, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. It was tall, at least 6 feet, and shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, but it was unmistakably human, standing just outside the clearing, watching me. I froze, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. Who was this? How had they gotten so close without me noticing? And why were they just standing there? "Hello," I called out again, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as still as the trees around it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stood up slowly, my hand gripping the flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it directly at the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light hit the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the tree line. The figure had vanished, disappeared without a sound. One moment it had been there, and the next it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No sound, no rustling leaves, no footsteps. Just the empty forest and the faint crackle of the fire behind me. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was my brain playing tricks on me? It didn't seem possible. I had seen it. I had felt that something, had been standing there. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. There was no way I was imagining this. I had seen something, but what? I slowly backed up to the fire, my eyes never leaving the tree line, and sat down, my flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. My body was tense, every muscle on edge, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. For hours I sat there, staring into the darkness, the fire slowly dying down to embers. The figure never reappeared, and the forest remained eerily silent. Eventually, exhaustion began to creep in. My body was drained from the tension, and my eyes grew heavy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whatever had been standing at the edge of the clearing was still out there, waiting. I glanced at my tent, debating whether I should try to sleep. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to hike back to the car in the dead of night and forget this trip had ever happened. But another part of me, the rational part, told me to stay. It was probably nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe my mind, tired from the stress of the last few weeks, was playing tricks on me. I finally decided to crawl into my tent, though I kept the flashlight beside me, my hand resting on it, just in case. I zipped the tent flap tightly shut and lay there, my eyes wide open, listening to the silence outside. Hours passed. The fire died completely, leaving the clearing in total darkness. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the stillness. But there were no more footsteps, no more figures at the edge of the camp. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. My body ached from the tension of the night before, and my mind was still fuzzy from lack of sleep. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes and glancing around the tent. Everything was where I had left it, my pack, my gear, the flashlight. Everything was normal. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, a wave of unease washed over me. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, except for one thing. At the edge of the clearing, where the figure had been standing, there were footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the soft earth, but they were there, clear, unmistakable footprints leading into the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I didn't care about breakfast or enjoying the sunrise. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Who or what had been watching me? Why hadn't they approached or said anything? And why had they disappeared without a trace, only to leave those footprints behind? By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know who or what was out there that night, watching me from the edge of the camp. But I do know one thing: I wasn't alone. And whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I had always found peace in the woods, something about the isolation, the silence, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees had a calming effect on me. So after a particularly grueling month at work, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I didn't want to deal with crowded campgrounds or noisy tourists. I wanted true solitude. So I picked a remote spot in the mountains, far off the beaten path, miles from the nearest road. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, but I didn't mind. The winding roads through the mountains were beautiful, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape, I felt my stress melt away. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and I was eager to get started on the hike. I grabbed my gear, locked the car, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely more than a faint path through the trees, but I had a map and knew the area well enough. The campsite I had in mind was about 2 hours in a small clearing by a creek, surrounded by towering pines. I'd camped there once before, years ago, and remembered it being the perfect spot for a quiet, peaceful night under the stars. The hike was uneventful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. As I walked, the sun continued to sink lower, the light filtering through the trees in long golden beams. It was the kind of peaceful setting I had been craving, and by the time I reached the clearing, I felt like I had left the stress of the world behind. The campsite looked exactly as I remembered it, an open space surrounded by dense forest, with a small stream trickling nearby. I set up my tent quickly, eager to relax before it got dark. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood and got a small fire going, the warmth of the flames pushing back the growing chill in the air. I sat by the fire, eating a simple dinner and watching the last light of the day fade from the sky. The stars began to twinkle overhead, and the forest grew darker, the trees looming tall and still around me. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the creek. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a vague unease, like something was just off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I sat there, staring into the fire, the more the feeling grew. The woods around me, which had felt peaceful and serene only moments ago, now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more intense. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had been looking forward to this solitude for weeks, of course. I wasn't used to it. But as I stared into the fire, that uneasy feeling continued to grow, settling like a weight in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the creek. But as I sat there, listening, the sound grew louder. It was a rhythmic thumping, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was faint, distant, but it was definitely there. A steady, deliberate thump, like something or someone was moving through the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too heavy. My heart began to race as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise, but the forest was too thick, too dark. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, and shone the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. Just the thick trunks and tangled branches, stretching out into the shadows. But the sound continued. Thump. Thump. It was closer now, still distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding echoed through the still night air, sending a shiver down my spine. I swept the flashlight back and forth, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the steady thump, 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 like something large and heavy was making its way through the woods. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an echo or a tree falling somewhere in the distance. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was moving. Closer. I backed up toward the fire, my eyes fixed on the tree line, every muscle in my body tense. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, the batteries beginning to wear down, but I didn't turn it off. I couldn't. The sound was getting louder, closer, and I needed to see what was coming. Thump. 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 It was coming from the left now, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight toward the sound, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows of trunks. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was completely still again, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. The rhythmic pounding was gone, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had heard, something someone had been moving through the woods. I waited listening, my ears straining for any sign of the sound returning. But there was nothing, just the silence of the night. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly lowered the flashlight and sat back down by the fire, my heart still racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things, maybe the isolation was getting to me. It had been a long hike, and I was tired. That had to be it. But as I sat there staring into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding in the trees, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire until the flames died down to embers, my eyes constantly darting to the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. The rhythmic thumping didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tightly shut. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. But the night passed without incident, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the early morning light. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, the fire reduced to ashes, the creek still babbling softly nearby. Everything was normal, peaceful. But as I packed up my gear, ready to head back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching, waiting. The hike back to the car was uneventful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the forest felt alive again. The unease I had felt during the night began to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of being outdoors. By the time I reached the car, I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a product of my overactive imagination. But as I loaded my gear into the trunk and prepared to leave, I heard it again. That sound. Thump. 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 It was distant, faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind in the trees. But it was there. I stood still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound didn't get any closer this time, didn't move toward me. It just lingered, faint, rhythmic. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I climbed into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sound faded as I sped down the gravel road, but the unease remained. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know what caused that sound, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was out there moving through the woods, watching me. And the next time I camp alone, I'll make sure it's nowhere near that place. The old cabin had been a family secret for as long as I could remember. My grandfather had built it decades ago, deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, far from any towns or roads. It wasn't listed on any maps, and the only way to get there was by hiking miles through dense forest. Growing up, my family would visit the cabin for long weekends or summer breaks, but as the years went on and life got busier, the trips became less frequent. By the time I was in my 20s, the cabin had been mostly forgotten. My parents hadn't mentioned it in years, and I had almost forgotten about it myself until I found the old key in my grandfather's belongings after he passed away. Holding that key, I felt an odd pull to visit the place again. It had been years since I had last seen the cabin, and the thought of spending a few quiet days in the woods sounded appealing. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed the escape. So I packed my gear, grabbed a map from an old hiking guide my grandfather had written, and set off to find the cabin. The drive took most of the day, winding through the mountains on roads that grew narrower and more rugged the further I went. By the time I parked at the edge of the forest, it was late afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the treetops. I grabbed my pack and the old key, locked the car, and started the long hike to the cabin. The trail was overgrown, barely recognizable in some places, but I managed to follow the route my grandfather had marked on the map. The forest was dense and quiet, the trees towering overhead and blocking most of the sunlight. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and I didn't expect this was one of the most remote parts of the state, miles from any towns or hiking trails. That was part of the cabin's appeal. It was a place where you could truly be alone. As I walked, memories of the cabin came flooding back. Summer afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, evenings by the fire with my family, and the comforting smell of pine that always seemed to linger in the air. I hadn't been back in nearly a decade, but it all felt familiar, like stepping into a forgotten chapter of my life. After about 2 hours of hiking, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked just as I remembered it: small, rustic, with a weathered wood exterior and a stone chimney that rose high above the roof. The windows were dark, the front door slightly crooked, but otherwise the cabin looked untouched by time. I walked up to the door and inserted the old key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside was just as I remembered: simple but cozy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a loft where the beds were. Dust covered most of the surfaces, and the air smelled stale, but otherwise the cabin seemed perfectly preserved. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear and cleaning up a bit, wiping down the counters and sweeping the floor. Once everything was settled, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat back, enjoying the warmth and the comforting crackle of the flames. The sun had set by now, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over me. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, like the cabin was too quiet. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I hadn't been here in years, and it was my first time staying alone. The isolation was bound to make me feel a little jumpy. I ate a quick dinner and settled into one of the old armchairs by the fire, listening to the wind howling softly outside. The cabin creaked occasionally, the wood groaning as the temperature dropped, but otherwise the night was silent. But then I heard it. A soft thud from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, listening intently, my heart starting to race. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, but the thud had been distinct, different from the natural sounds of the forest. I stood up slowly, glancing toward the front door. The cabin had no electricity, and I had only the fire and a few old lanterns for light. The windows were dark, reflecting the dim glow of the fire inside, but I couldn't see anything beyond them. Another thud. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, maybe near the back door. I grabbed one of the lanterns and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hand shook slightly as I lifted the lantern and walked toward the back of the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. The back door was closed, just as I had left it, but as I approached, I heard another sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I opened the door and stepped outside, holding the lantern up to illuminate the area around me. Nothing. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees and the dark forest loomed all around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No animals, no tracks, just the cold, empty night. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the chill air, straining to hear any other sounds. But the thudding had stopped, and the scraping was gone. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself, or an animal brushing against the cabin. There were plenty of raccoons and deer in these woods. It wasn't unusual for them to wander close. I took a deep breath and stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I placed the lantern on the kitchen counter and returned to the living area, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But as I sat by the fire, my mind kept going back to the sound. It hadn't been the wind. I was sure of that. And it hadn't sounded like an animal either. It had been too deliberate, too. Heavy. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but the cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the shadows cast by the fire longer and darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. As the fire began to die down, I decided to head to bed, hoping sleep would take my mind off things. I climbed up the narrow wooden ladder to the loft, where two old beds were tucked under the slanted roof. I picked the one furthest from the window, threw my sleeping bag over the mattress, and lay down, staring up at the wooden beams above me. But sleep didn't come. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, and every noise made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the thud, the scraping, the feeling that something had been outside the cabin, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. The isolation was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was silent. The fire had died out completely, leaving the room in total darkness. I reached for my phone to check the time, 2:17 a.m. I lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, trying to figure out what had woken me up. And then I heard it. The slow, deliberate creak coming from downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of floorboards groaning under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard any windows break, but there was no denying it, something was downstairs. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind again, or the old wood shifting in the cold night air. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I lay there, completely still, listening to the slow, deliberate creaks coming from the living room. Whatever it was moving slowly, carefully, as if trying not to make too much noise. I grabbed the old lantern I had left by the bed and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hands shook as I climbed out of bed and crept toward the ladder, peering down into the living room below. The cabin was empty. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the room in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the lantern in my hand. But then I saw it. The front door. It was wide open, the cold night air blowing into the cabin. I stared at the door, my heart racing, trying to remember if I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure I had. I always locked the door. But now it was standing open, the darkness of the forest beyond it, silent and still. I backed away from the ladder, my hands trembling, and slowly descended, keeping the lantern held high. I didn't know what I expected to find, but every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were still by the fire, the table untouched. But the door, it hadn't been opened before. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to shut it and lock it. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. There, in the soft dirt just outside the door, were footprints. They were large, far too large to be mine, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, threw the lock, and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who or what had been outside my cabin that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't staying another minute to find out what had been watching me. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and left the cabin, running through the dark forest, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and terrified. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Camping had always been a way for me to escape. It wasn't just about nature, it was about getting away from the pressures of daily life, the endless stream of emails, and the constant noise of the city. I preferred to camp in isolated places, deep in the woods, where I could be alone with my thoughts. That's why I had chosen this particular spot, miles away from any road, at the edge of a small, crystal-clear lake nestled in the middle of a thick forest. The day had been beautiful. I spent the morning hiking, exploring the area around the lake, and in the afternoon I fished by the shore. There wasn't a soul for miles, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface of the water. By the time the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the lake, I felt at peace. I set up my tent just a few yards from the water, the flap facing the lake, so I could wake up to the sunrise over the water. I lit a small fire, cooked a simple dinner, and then sat back to enjoy the fading light as the sky turned from pink to purple, then deepened into the inky black of night. It was one of those nights that felt almost magical. The stars were out in full force, twinkling above the towering trees, and the air was cool but not too cold. I sat by the fire, sipping hot tea and listening to the quiet of the forest. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the starry sky like a mirror. It was everything I had wanted, a night of perfect solitude. But as the fire began to die down, a strange feeling settled over me. It started as a subtle sensation, a vague unease that I couldn't quite place. The kind of feeling you get when you think you've forgotten something important, but you can't remember what it is. I glanced around the clearing, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the trees, but everything looked the same as it had before. The forest was quiet, the lake still. There was nothing out of place. Still, the feeling persisted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had spent too much time alone, that was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I stood up, stretched, and decided it was time to head to bed. I poured the last of my tea into the fire, dousing the remaining flames, and turned toward my tent. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the weak moonlight, but unmistakably there. A figure, standing perfectly still, half hidden behind one of the tall pine trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the shape. It didn't move. It was just standing there, watching me. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting odd shadows. But as I squinted into the darkness, my stomach twisted in fear. It was a person. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details, but there was no doubt about it. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. Is someone there? Still nothing. The air felt colder now, and the quiet of the forest, which had been peaceful just moments before, now felt oppressive. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette at the edge of my camp, blending into the shadows of the trees. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the clearing, the edge of the camp, but when I pointed it toward the figure, there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. My breath caught in my throat, and I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No rustling of leaves, no sound of footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? But I knew what I had seen. There had been someone standing there watching me. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I quickly made my way to my tent, zipping the flap shut behind me. My hands were still trembling as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the flashlight resting beside me within easy reach. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence outside. Every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, watching my tent. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no shadows. The forest remained silent, and slowly, I began to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But the peace didn't last long. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what had woken me up at first. There hadn't been any loud noises, no rustling outside the tent. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, I felt it. Someone was outside. The air in the tent felt thick, oppressive, and my skin prickled with the undeniable sensation that I wasn't alone. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, any movement. And then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise coming from just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of my camp. My heart raced and I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on. The light was weak, the batteries already starting to die, but I pointed it toward the tent flap, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for something to happen. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the night. But then, from just outside the tent, I heard it again. A soft whisper. Low, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat, and I clutched the flashlight tighter, my mind racing. Who was out there? What were they doing? I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to speak, couldn't bring myself to move. The fear was too overwhelming, too paralyzing. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the tent, just inches away from where I sat frozen in terror. I flicked the flashlight off, plunging the tent into darkness, and backed up against the far side of the tent, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting, praying that whoever or whatever was outside would go away. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent slowly, deliberately, and then stopped directly in front of the tent flap. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming with fear. The zipper of the tent flap moved, slowly, inch by inch. I shot forward, gripping the zipper and pulling it closed with shaking hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the weight of the presence just outside the thin fabric of the tent, the air thick with tension, but I couldn't bring myself to open the flap, to confront whatever was out there. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The footsteps faded into the distance, disappearing into the quiet of the forest, and the whispering stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the silence of the night returned. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there, huddled in the corner of the tent, the flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for the footsteps to return. But they never did. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the fabric of the tent, I crawled out, blinking in the pale morning light. The clearing was empty, the lake perfectly still, and there was no sign that anyone had been there during the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands still trembling from the fear that had gripped me throughout the night. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't even look back at the lake. I just grabbed my gear and left, hiking back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I don't know who or what had been outside my tent that night. I don't know if I had imagined the whole thing, or if someone had been watching me, lurking just beyond the trees. But I do know one thing: I haven't camped alone since. And I never will again.